It's my pleasure to introduce today's guests. Ginni Rometty was the 9th chair, president and CEO of IBM. Under her leadership, the 100-year-old company reinvented 50% of its portfolio, built a $25 billion hybrid cloud business, and established leadership in AI and quantum computing. Rometty also drove record results in diversity and inclusion and supported the explosive growth of an innovative high school program to prepare the workforce of the future in over 28 countries. Through her work with the Business Roundtable, Rometty helped redefine the purpose of the corporation. She has been named Fortune's #1 most powerful woman 3 years in a row, is a member of the National Academy of Engineering, and has been honored with the designation of Officer in the French Légion d'honneur. Today, Rometty serves on multiple boards and co-chairs 110, a coalition committed to upskilling, hiring, and promoting 1 million Black Americans without four-year degrees by 2030 into family-sustaining jobs and careers. She's married to Mark Rometty, who is with her here today, and she is the author of the best-selling book, Good Power: Creating Positive Change in Our Lives, Work, and World. Neel Kashkari has been president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis since January of 2016. He serves as a member of the Federal Open Market Committee, bringing the 9th Federal Reserve District's perspective to monetary policy discussions in Washington. In addition, Neel oversees the Minneapolis Fed operations and leads its many initiatives. He was instrumental in establishing the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute, whose mission is to ensure that world-class research helps to improve the economic well-being of all Americans. Most recently, he's supported the expansion of the Center for Indian Country Development, which advances the prosperity of Native nations and indigenous communities through actionable data and research. Neel earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in mechanical engineering from the University of Illinois. He became an aerospace engineer, developing technology for NASA missions. Eventually, he turned to finance and public policy. He earned his MBA from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, joined Goldman Sachs, and served in several senior positions at the U.S. Department of Treasury, including overseeing the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, during the financial crisis. Before joining the Minneapolis Fed, he spent 4 years at PIMCO, and then in 2014 ran for governor of California on a platform focused on economic opportunity. He lives with his wife Christine, children Uli and Tecumseh, and Newfoundland dog Webster in Orono, Minnesota. And with that, I'm going to call Ginni and our leader, Neel, forward to have their conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tim, for the very warm introduction. Great to see everybody again. Always great to be back with you here at the Economic Hub of Minnesota. I met Ginni last summer. We were at a conference together, and she gave this remarkable talk, and we were chatting, and you're going to see in a moment just how engaging she is and how experienced she is. And then she mentioned that she comes through Minnesota a couple times a year, and my eyes lit up, and I said, well, actually, let me know next time you're coming through Minnesota. We might have a wonderful event for you. So thank you, Ginni, for joining us here at the Economic Club. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, and thank you. When we got to meet, we have the same views on a lot of things too, though. So it was my pleasure to do it for you.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I want to start. We have a lot of ground to cover. Ginni's career is remarkable. I want to get to a lot of her leadership lessons from IBM that are relevant to businesses today that we're all struggling with today. But to set that up, and then I want to talk about AI and a bunch of other things that she knows a lot about. To set that up, let's start with your personal story. You've spoken about this, you've written about it. I think your personal story, as I learned about it, really sets the foundation. Some of the things you faced as a child set the foundation for how you viewed leadership throughout your journey. So maybe we could just start at the start.
Yeah, well, I'll start there, but I will have to say, looking around the room, I never really thought much about it until I went to write this book, which is a long story of how I got kind of pushed it. I told Neel, a mutual friend of ours, Hank Paulson, kind of convinced me I should write a book. And I would just recommend it now in retrospect, as painful as it was, that it's probably worth, for those of you a little bit further in your careers, to take the time to think back to the beginning. And I know most people that have read the book who know me, they're like, oh, I wish I'd read this earlier. Now I know exactly why you're like you are. And I'm not sure they always meant that as a compliment, but that was what they say. So just, it does, as I've reflected back, really it's the foundation of a lot of stuff that we'll talk about today. So what Neel's referring to is, I was raised by what I would call just a group of strong women, but who each suffered immense tragedies in their life. My great-grandma was the last person alive in her family in Belarus. All were killed in the World War, and she came to America, and she would never speak English. She would clean bathrooms in Chicago at the Wrigley Building, save every dime, and it would be because of what she would save that one day we would be able to have a car. My grandma, widowed twice, and by the time she was probably 30, would then run a lamp store, and she would, every dime she saved, making lampshades by hand, would be the reason one day we would come off the street and have a house. And my mother, when I was very young, my father abandoned my mother, and there were 4 of us kids, and he left her with no money and no home. So we were homeless, no money, on welfare, and my mom was just so determined this wouldn't be how this story should end. And she'd only had a high school degree and never worked outside the home. And she went back to school, got just a little bit of education, finally enough to get a job, eventually enough to get us off of federal programs and aid. And it has a happy ending. And I always say, I tell the story, like, not for anyone to look at me or my mom as a victim. It's actually to celebrate my mom and my grandma and my great-grandma, because, you know, they always taught me, it doesn't matter how bad life is, there is always a way forward. And my mom taught us, you know what, she was never gonna let my dad define her as a loser or anything else. And she taught us, only you define who you are in life now. You know, she never said it, but that's what we learned watching her. And so to me, that kind of forms the basis of who I am, because I end up believing it's really true. We were just talking about our country, that it's true for a person or a company or a country. You know, if you don't define yourself, someone else will by their actions. And so that's kind of the basis. So to me, there's always a way forward. It doesn't matter how hard life gets. And that's kind of how, and I got some hard jobs after that, and that's how I always looked at them.
Thank you. So let's go a little bit forward. And you went to Northwestern for, how'd you end up in, you know, we have a lot of young people today. How'd you end up at that college? I think about my own decision where I went to college. When you're 17 or 18 years old, you make these decisions with a little bit of information. How did you end up where you ended up, and what was your journey to IBM?
Well, I know I met a lot of the young folks here, which I'm so glad you do that. But unlike today, where I think those of you with kids, I'm watching my nephew, he applies to 20 schools. I could afford to apply to 2, okay? So there were just 2. And they had to be schools that would give you financial aid if you couldn't afford to be there. And so I applied to a state school. I thought I could for sure get in, and one stretch school, that was Northwestern, and then just prayed. And I was lucky enough to get into Northwestern. And so both in Chicago, couldn't get on a plane, had to be somewhere you could get to in a car, and University of Illinois in Chicago, and in Northwestern. So that's what brought me there, and I had a love of math. And so I started in engineering, and that's where I always stayed.
And then what was your first job?
Oh, so this is funny. For those, are there anybody in a car company here? Before I offend anyone? I just gotta be sure about this. I'm always. Actually,
we are live streaming this, but go ahead.
My best friend now, one of my best friends, Mary Barra, right? So I always say to her, Mary, she runs General Motors. I worked for General Motors at first. I got really, again, lucky. A professor said, look, I know you're paying for school yourself and financial aid. GM has this wonderful program. If you can get this scholarship, they'll pay for everything. And I did get the scholarship. So I felt a great obligation to go work there for a few years. And the only reason I tell the story, there's a good lesson in it for the young people. I went to work for General Motors, and I was doing cars and buses. And it's not that I don't love cars and buses, right? And getting called in the middle of the night, like, why is the assembly line down and all? And I'm like, whoa. And my husband had said, you know, you've got this engineering degree, and you love computers. Like, you know, why are you doing this? And I said I learned at a really young age the difference between a job and a career. And it was a job to me, right? I could go, I could do it easily, but that's not a career. And so I didn't have passion. I say, Mary, you love cars. I do not love cars. And so I didn't want to offend any car people here. And so that's what took me to IBM.
Got it. Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead now. You write about running towards conflict is something that you're drawn to.
Yeah.
And I will say this is something you and I have in common. I would say not for the sake of conflict, but there's an opportunity. If everybody's afraid to go somewhere, then there's an opportunity there to go explore it. In Minnesota, we tend to be conflict avoidant culturally. Fair enough? Okay. So talk about running towards conflict. Were you always this way? How did other people react? How do you use it as a tool?
Well, so this is, I found, Neel had mentioned this to me, and this is ironic for me to end up back in Minnesota on this, because I think the first time this came alive to me was Minnesota. And early in my career, I spent a good 5 or 6 years commuting here every week, consulting to some companies here when IBM was building a consulting business. But it was the first time I learned a phrase, because we were doing work, and I think, well, didn't we agree on this already? And it would be open again. And I'm like, we got to go back through this, but didn't we do it? And someone said to me, oh, you don't understand. Everyone votes, and the polls never close here. And I said, And I was like, this is interesting to me. Same client then taught me, because I was still young, and I was like, okay, trying to get them to move forward. And I remember in a big board meeting, and afterwards, it was some bad news I had to deliver. And he said to me, and I thought he was going to yell at me. And he said, I think you have a velvet hammer. And I said, well, what's that? I'm like, is that an insult? He's like, no. You told me really bad stuff in a way that I could do something with it. And it was kind of like my first, these two sides of a coin, introduction to conflict, of like, is it a bad thing or a good thing to be in conflict? And so one of the big points in the book I try to make is, in today's world, like, nothing's black and white. It's all full of tension. It's all full of conflict. And that if you would run toward it, I feel really strongly. I've worked with people, I watch them. People would say, this is the most horrible thing to work on. And somebody would go, I'll take that. And I'm like, why are they always volunteering? And what I would watch was, usually, 95% of the time, they came out in a better place than where it started. And I thought, this is a very interesting thing. If you would, like, don't be afraid and go toward it, you would say you'll explore something new. I would find I'd usually, if I really listened, I could get something to a better place at the end of the day, and I would have learned something out of it. So I'm a big advocate of trying to get people to go towards conflict. And in the last thing, and someone asked me about this, a little bit of IBM history, I also feel most answers aren't black and white, and that doesn't mean gray and compromise. I think the other thing I learned about conflict is there's usually a third way through something. If you sit in the mess long enough, you will find it. And I wish that way sort of in government today. There people would, it's not like your way or my way.
Sure.
If you would really, and I always felt, even when I did a lot of work with education and government, one thing I could get, no matter what their beliefs were, people cared about jobs. It didn't matter if you're Republican, Democrat, it didn't matter who you were. And if I could listen hard enough to those issues, I could usually make progress on all agendas. And so that idea of there's always a third way through was the other thing. So when you said you love conflict, you're the birthplace of me starting to love conflict. It was Minnesota. It was all those years in Minnesota taught me, ironically, to look for and love conflict.
But let me ask you, though, looking back on your even younger self then, do you recognize maybe you loved conflict the whole time?
The only thing I would have to say about that is, being the oldest, and my sister's siblings and brother, they're not here, I think I was always the peacemaker. So I think that teaches you a little bit about conflict. I mean, I think we felt my mom had it so horrible, like the last thing we could do was cause more trouble for her. So I was always the one trying to take care of all the issues, and so that we didn't cause more problems. And I think that's what it probably roots to.
Interesting. Okay.
How about you? Where did yours come from?
Oh, boy.
You sound like, yours sounds like from a fighting background or something. Mine's from such a good place. Yours is from a bad place, it sounds like.
No. I thought we agreed we weren't going to do this. We weren't going to have you turning questions around on me.
My husband times how long it takes me to do that. Yeah.
It's funny, at the Federal Reserve, people are generally, it's very Minnesotan, people are generally conflict avoidant. one of my colleagues, I'm not going to name, says that I'm conflict seeking. And I actually think that there's truth to that. But I'm conflict seeking because if everybody's afraid to explore over here because it's scary, then that's where I want to go, because there's probably something good over there that is left.
I agree with that.
People haven't looked at it yet. So let's talk about you. You write about a lot about the importance of managers and mentors throughout your career in IBM. Can you give some examples of when has that really been important to you?
Yeah, and as I looked around the room, again, we've got people across a whole spectrum of life in their careers here. And the reason I take some time to write about this topic is I think a lot of people will say to me, I need a mentor, or I need a sponsor, I need this one person. And I actually really believe that's the wrong way to view life. And I feel so strongly that anyone you talk to, like I learned a lot from Neel, if you look at anyone as a mentor, you don't have to tell them they're the mentor, but if you just treat them with respect and ask them questions, they will be your mentor and sponsor. I've never met someone who wouldn't. And therefore I say to if I'm talking to younger people, I'd be like, look at everyone that way as a mentor. Don't try to, it isn't like that some one person pulls you up through the world. It's more about if you were willing to ask questions and ask more than you talk. Okay, it's like I'm going to talk a lot up here, but in real life, ask more questions than you answer. And I think you'll have tons of mentors. Now, I would make a question. You say, what about the ones I had? Look, I grew up in really great companies. IBM at that time had a very big presence here in Minnesota, in Rochester. And the biggest thing I think I got from those mentors were two things. So those of us who are mentors now, I think one, they taught me to lead with values instead of rules. And like the one story that burns in my mind, I will always remember, I'm a very young manager, and I had a man who worked for me who was telling dirty jokes. I guess that's what you call them today, or off color. And this is back in the 80s. And people were uncomfortable. And I went to my boss, I'm a new manager, and I went to the boss and told him about it. And the guy was the top performer. And my boss says to me, he goes, well, this is easy. You tell him to stop immediately or you fire him. I'm like, but he's our best performer. He says, that's got nothing to do with this. And like such a simple thing would always leave this in my mind about value-based decisions. And I see that issue with young companies now, that when they don't have really good values, they get very whipsawed around on their decisions. And so I learned that. So that would be my one thing, is as those of us now mentoring people, I think teaching them to lead with values. And the second thing, though, is I think the most important. They always believed in me more than I believed in myself. And I think that, to me, is like one of the greatest values as a mentor. And I see this with so many young people today, that if your role is just to tell them, and I see it particularly with women, that you can do it. No, go ahead, take that risk, you can do it. So that would be my two.
That's great.
You don't want to answer it either? How about?
Well, one of the things that you said about sponsorship, I hear that a lot is, I need a sponsor.
Yeah.
And as though like there's this fairy godmother that's going to come along and just tap you on the shoulder and make your career. And my answer when I thought about what they meant is, I said sponsorship is earned, right? You want mentors to share with you what they know, to coach you, but then ultimately you have to deliver. And like, so Hank Paulson, somebody that our mutual friend, former Treasury Secretary, my mentor in many ways, and I give him great credit. I learned a tremendous amount from him, but I also recognize I did a really good job for him. So when he came along and gave me promotions, it was in his own interest to give me the promotion because it gave me more ability to take on bigger assignments for him. So it wasn't, it wasn't the notion of sponsorship, somebody giving you something. It's somebody recognizing in you the job that you're able to do.
Yeah, when I was really young, I worked for someone and I feel like I've apprenticed my whole life, but he used to say to me, if someone asks you for help, you give it to them early because you're going to learn something. And I really, this idea of networking people talk about, which I also think is people are like, oh, I just got to get to know more people. I don't believe in that either. It all came from who you actually helped along the way. And I say that, and then in those moments of need, they mysteriously do come back to you over. It could be a decade later, right? But it comes back to you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, let's jump around a little bit. One of the big challenges that IBM has faced over time that we're all wrestling with right now is work from home. How do you make it work? What are your lessons learned? IBM was at this much earlier than the rest. The rest of us confronted it because of COVID and the post-COVID. Just Tell us about work from home. What did you learn?
Well, for how many people are, well, what's the right answer? What do I want? How many people are still sorting out what work from home means? Oh, nobody. Okay, 3, 4. Okay, are the rest of you at home? Okay, how many know it, love it? Okay, how many are sleeping right now? I'm not sure.
How many aren't sure how to answer the
How to
question?
answer the question. Okay, so work from home, when you say we were at it earlier, you know, I feel like that, wasn't that the country song, like I was country when country wasn't cool or something like that? I don't know. And so just I think was the nature of our business. So I can remember, I happen to, like, whenever I'll do like a media interview or something, I will write some notes after, mostly because I want to see if they misquote me, which is typical. And, but I'll, you know, just remember what I said. And I can remember when the pandemic just hit, and I was going on CNBC, it was March 14th, and the first question is like about work from home. And you know, it was all that, what is it, what do you do? And I can remember saying, because we'd done it for so long, I said, but my biggest learning of work from home is teams have to learn how to self-govern themselves. You can't dictate rules. And I don't think everyone, like, we had to come to learn that, right? So it's like, you can't say, oh, pick your 3 days, pick your 2 days, or we're all gonna do these days. And so self-governance was, to me, like one of the biggest learnings. Those of you that have worked from home, teams have to learn to self-govern because they gotta get work done. And so in a really mature company that did a lot of work from home, they kind of learned that over decades of how to do that. And so that was one of my big learnings. But I will tell you, I think work from home's like a pendulum, you know? It goes too far this way, it goes too far this way. And there was probably a good year I was like on the front page of the Wall Street Journal for, we had made people come back to an office. Now this would be 2014. It was marketing people. We had maybe 800 in the United States, and it had devolved to, I think I had like 4 in each state. And they could each work in their basement in 4 different corners. And we're like, okay, this is like super hard. You can't get work done this way. And we told people they had to come back to their offices, 8 hubs in the United States. Oh my God, you'd have thought I was killing all of them. And I'd gotten one of the emails I can remember so vividly, it was, do you understand, if I have to do this, I will no longer have time to be the mayor or the coach of the softball teams. I'm like, well, this is kind of precisely the point. Yeah. And so, I'm like, yep, that is a big problem. I mean, appreciate you owing up to this, you know? And, but that's what I mean on this pendulum thing. And so I think what I learned out of that was, it wasn't about rules again. I think we were more about, and this was one of the things we'd had to do, which is introduce agile working. And those of you that, you know, now that's commonplace. At the early 2010s, that was not in a company of 500,000 people to do agile, which you need small multidisciplinary teams together to get work done. And so versus telling people you can't work from home, it was really about changing how their work was done. And that was more what I learned about from that essence. And I would just say the last thing, even now, I think, I even kind of hate the words work from home. I really think it's just more about, do you have the right flexibility, you know, kind of policies? Because that's really what people want at the end of the day. Individually, if I've got to take care of something, I feel free that I can go do it. Yeah. I'm curious why you had that on your list, though. Do you?
So we are at the Minneapolis Fed. I'm in the office every day that I'm not traveling. For most staff, and other leaders are like me. For most staff, it's 3 days a week in. But we're still trying to figure out. We have not mandated which 3 days.
Yeah,
and
see,
so
that's tough.
Some people come in and they say, well, I'm in, but nobody I work with is in, so I might as well be home. Well, that's true. That's kind of silly. Or some departments work with other departments, and the one department is in on certain days, and the department that they work with a lot are in different days. So it's this frictions around the margins that we're still trying to sort out. We adopted 3 days in about 2 years ago, much more aggressively than the other reserve banks. I think most of industry has moved in our direction. I'm not sure where it's ultimately going to settle out, and I'm with you that I don't want to do top-down, heavy hands, you must do it this way, but I'm also feeling like absent that, we're not getting it quite right now.
Yeah, but that's that the team has to self-govern, because the only other comment I'd say to that, again, to some people in the room, I always say to people on this topic, okay, forget about what you care about, what the boss wants or Neel wants. Okay, think about, even if you just think about what's in it for yourself. I go back to like, I learned the most in life now that, you know, and I worked at IBM 40 years, so I've had a long career. And I learned the most apprenticing other people, and it wasn't by appointment, and it wasn't by Zoom. And so, depending on the kind of profession you're in, I think you're always apprenticing, and that only happens when you are serendipity of being around certain situations. And I don't know how to engineer that on a schedule for you, right? So if you do it for no other reason, do it for yourself, come in at times, right?
But every senior person, I believe that 100%. Every senior person I know says that, and somehow I don't feel like people believe us.
Yeah, well, that's because we're old.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, fossils.
Exactly. Okay, let's jump around a little bit more. One challenge in this region is this is a perennial challenge. Can't find the skilled workers that we need for our companies, that we don't have the population growth that we need. You faced this at IBM. What did you learn?
Okay.
How did you approach it?
Okay, this will border on a monologue for 1 second, or a minute or two with you, because I feel so, Neel knows, this is the topic he saw me talk on, that I feel so strongly about, and came to feel strongly about it for reasons that I think are super valid. So I told you the story just a little bit about my mom, right? And what I witnessed with my mom, I got this really big lesson, and it'll come into play to answer his question. I watched when my mom went back to school and could get a job. She never did get a college degree, by the way. But I thought, you know what? My mom's pretty smart. She's got a lot of aptitude, but she never had access to what I ended up having access to, right? So that, like, I'm an engineer, so like equations stay in my head, that access and aptitude are not equal in this country. In most countries I would learn in the world. So I'm going to fast forward then, I'm CEO, it's 2012, now commonplace. I need cyber people. We've got a big security business, we need thousands of them. You can't get them anywhere. And so I happened to serendipity walk into a meeting on corporate social responsibility. And the guy say to me, hey, we got this one little high school somewhere, and it's in Brooklyn, really poor neighborhood. They're high schoolers. We're going to help them with curriculum. We're going to give them some mentorships, internships. Oh, we even said we might give them a job if we had an opening. And I'm like, it's fine, sounds fine. Oh, we're going to do it in cyber. Fine, too. I come back a little bit later. I say, how'd that go? They said, oh, my God, they're doing outstanding. And I'm like, I need thousands of these people. I say, well, how many did we hire? I couldn't ever hear their voice. I said, what? They're like, 3. I'm like, 3. And they're like, I said, okay, you told me they're doing a great job. Why aren't you hiring these people? They said, because every job we have requires a college degree. I said, or a PhD. I said, but they can do the job. I don't really understand. And I said, well, okay. It would start to, in my mind, the second equation would be where you start should not determine where you end, just like where my mom, and where it could have been for me. And I then started to ask questions, and so this would be a 10-year journey for me. And I would say, okay, well, how many people in this country don't have a college degree? I didn't know this number. You know it. Of course you know it, because you're looking at labor all the time. It's 65%. And then I'm like, okay, well, this must not be true in other developed countries. No, they're all about 65% do not have college degrees. We'll talk later maybe about in George Floyd, and 80% of black Americans don't have a college degree. I'm like, okay. Then I said, well, okay, I knew 100% of my jobs required it. And I said, but let's start looking at, and I had a wonderful HR leader who said, well, let me start looking. If I wrote down what skill was needed, not the degree, maybe this would look different. So we started re-looking at all the job descriptions, which is a very tedious, oh my God, it took 5 years, okay? But to make a long story short, in the end, instead of 100% requiring college degrees, 50% actually require them to get started. And that one school would turn into about 350 around the world, and about 200,000 kids coming through. But more was born out of it, this paradigm, which I now help companies around the world do. Skills first. Hire for skills over degrees. And not just a degree. Doesn't mean it's bad. Not about two-class citizens. Back to we just have different starting points. And because I now have data, okay, because I have all these engineers working for me, I had to prove, because they all accused me of dumbing down the workforce and all sorts of things. So this is the one thing when you're there a long time, you can like listen to stuff and come back at them, and you're like, okay, just wait a minute, we get some more data. And as it turned out, 75% of those people all went in and got degrees. First PhDs coming through. So this wasn't an issue of their aptitude. This was pure access. And oh, by the way, 90% were Black and Hispanic. So in my view, this is like a new talent pool we all need, by the way, which you are completely overlooking, because God does spread aptitude pretty equally. And so, not access, but aptitude, yes. And so I became just well, you can tell, that's my monologue, over this idea of skills first, hire for degrees over just, hire for skills, not just a degree. And I really believe, I've come to believe, and again, Neel heard me say this, I think this is fundamental if you believe in democracy, because right now, a lot of people in this country don't think they're gonna have a better future. And they don't think their kids are gonna do better than them. And they can't get a good job and support, because I mean middle-class jobs that support a family of 4 when I say this. I'm not talking about low-end labor. I'm not talking about an $18 housekeeping. I am on good-paying jobs, $70,000, $100,000. And they're there. And with AI coming, to me, this is the only way through it. And when people say, well, get everybody a college degree, I was like, we don't have time. Even if you wanted to do it and had the money, you don't have time. And so the unrest will grow faster than people feeling they can contribute, successfully to their families and society. So again, sorry, you're probably gonna leave after. You think I'm gonna make you sign a petition or something, but I mean, I'm just, if I could convince you, if you hire people, if you would take the time to rewrite, and then we were just talking with one of the young ladies I met who's teaching on this. The biggest roadblock is your own teams, right? Because it is so inbred in us that a college degree is a ticket, that they must know how to do certain things and how to hire. The bias is so strong. It takes a lot of cultural change and a lot of CEOs to lead to really stay with this topic. But if you do, it is so rewarding, and it opens up. So I learned, again, with my all 5 years of data afterwards, they were more retentive, more loyal, performed better after 1 year. Performed better. Okay, so I'm thinking, in many cases, less expensive because they're starting at a different level. I'm like, so what do I not like about this equation? And so now, today, well, when I retired, 20% of IBM's hiring in this country was non-degreed people. I mean, so it takes time, but it was already 20, and we're a huge hirer. So it had come through. So sorry, I could like give another hour on this topic, because I mean, there's lots of things, to my ex-congressmen and senators and all, I mean, there's things in our policies that just have to change. And with AI coming, we're all gonna have to go back to school. Like, this once and done is over. And so, Pell Grants, all these things that are made for a world where you go to school once, or you don't get a certificate, or the use of community colleges. I should have mentioned community colleges were part of this formula. They're so overlooked. And as you know, other countries like Switzerland and Germany, they use apprenticeships and all. Not everybody goes to universities, right? Vocational schools have a role in life. So.
All right, so I'm
exhausted now,
right.
So I have to take a break.
You're not done yet. You're not done yet. So I'm going to come back to you with one follow-up to that, which has a Minnesota connection, and then I want to get the audience ready for some Q&A with the audience.
I do have some of those six-year high schools, by the way, that were getting associate degrees in high school at the same time. They're here in Minnesota, so kids doing super duper.
Okay. Well, maybe you can talk about that in this answer to one question. You launched 110. Which Tim mentioned about, which is related to the topic we were just talking about. George Floyd was, of course, murdered here in Minneapolis. International news, huge shock to I think everybody. Just can you talk about what 110 is and how it's going?
Yeah, and there are some of the big companies here that are members, but I want to talk about what it is and then what changed in the zeitgeist here, and in like what's happened now. So in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, businesses, everyone's outraged, systemic racism, and some people were doing a lot of talking, others were giving money, and two of my colleagues, who are my good friends, I've known them for different reasons a long time, Ken Chenault ran American Express, and Ken Frazier ran a drug company called Merck. They're arguably the two most senior Black business leaders in this country to this day. And I knew them both well. And they said, no, we should do a business, forget all this talking and money. What businesses can do is give people jobs. So they had this great vision. As I always say, they're the visionary, I am their plumber, but they didn't know how to do it. I'm like, okay, if 80% of blacks do not have a college degree, and as it turns out, for all companies, 80% require a college degree, as I would find, we'd survey them all, okay, you can't give them jobs. I mean, this is just, I would always say to people, this is just math. And so, but if you adopt skills first and really start reworking everything, there's a way. So we formed 110 to say, could we put 1 million people in middle-class, family-sustaining jobs? We started at that time as saying Black Americans. We really were targeting, because this is where the problem was most acute, 80% without college degrees. And we would have to then, the first thing, we'd teach all the companies how to do skills first and work with them to change the culture, and then to go find you gotta get people the skills. I mean, they can't be nothing. So you have to work with vocational, community colleges, you gotta work on it. So that's how it was born. And we're now up to about 200,000, but we're 3 years in. So it's been harder than we thought. The bias is stronger than you would think, and maybe you wouldn't think, and the one really smart thing we did is we made it be a CEO-led. You might say, because it's so cultural, the issues you're dealing with on the topic. And we knew it would take a long time, and any initiative dies after 1 or 2 years if it doesn't have some really strong support at the top. And so we did that right. And then what happened on the heels of the Supreme Court decision and some of the other things that have happened, I mean, you feel this intense backlash to, quote, DEI or, greenwashing and ESG. And I can see it in lots of companies, and we see it. And we've really had to talk to people about, be careful. What we are doing helps everyone. Yes, we targeted this most acute group like a startup would to get started. But the skills first idea raises all boats. And so so how we're doing now, I mean, some companies, they don't care what people say. Others are like, oh, I'm gonna keep doing it, but I don't wanna talk about it anymore. So it's interesting to watch, because I worry about this moment that, again, the pendulum swings, yet this idea of skills first for our country, all developed countries, is, I think, the right thing to keep moving on, and it does lift all boats. And so we keep saying, no, this is about another equation, the best way to deal with any kind of systemic racism or inequality is economic opportunity. And that's all we're trying to do. And that helps anybody in that.
Yeah. Or if you go back to IBM example, it's
I need
getting
the
the talent
employees.
that you need.
I said, I'm like, I need the employees. What's wrong, right?
Yeah,
Yes. Just
exactly.
decide your own reasons, but that's why, yeah.
So let me look around. Do we have the microphones ready?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So why don't we, I see some hands are up. Go ahead over there in the corner. Please introduce yourself when you ask Ginni a question.
We know each other already. I met him.
Right. So my name is Shashindra Holkar, and I'm coming from University of Minnesota Carlson Schools of Management. And my question is, I'm really glad you brought that access versus the aptitude. And then when we go more higher level, the soft skills are become more important. And for the companies, it's hard to distinguish the soft skill. It's because they are intangible, and also it depends on the personal biases. So how we can create a system that so people with the soft skills are easy to approach and distinguish. So do you have any experience or mechanism for that?
Yeah, the soft skills.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Shwarm, you bring up a very good point, because when I talked about skills first hiring, by the way, this is a super good point. Actually, the soft skills are harder to develop than the, quote, hard skills. And this is what I also came to believe. Most of us can teach people any of these hard skills they need to know, which is also why I quit hiring people for knowing exactly X or Y. And by the way, if they'd only done X or Y for 30 years, they don't really want to do Z, okay? They only want to do one thing. In the rate of change of technology, the skills are changing 3 to 5 years. So if I hire you for this, if I don't hire someone who loves to learn, and that is what we did to end up changing our hiring, we test for ability to learn and willingness to want to learn and curiosity. That's really what you want. And so, because if you're that, I can handle all the rest as your employer. And so it would change, like I said, it would be the first thing we would start to then, and you can test for people's willingness, propensity to learn, and curiosity. And that's what I would hire based on number one, to be first. And then the soft skills, people have this view that, oh, if you went to college, you must have good soft skills. good presenter, you're a good talker, you're good. It's not true. And so the facts, I mean, as evidenced up here, so not always true. So that point, I think, is the soft skills are the ones that you really want schools to build more on for people coming out, so they've got some more of that. I can remember, this is a funny story, when one of these first schools, they were called P-Tech schools, 6-year high schools, one of the first ones President Obama came to. So he comes in, of course, since President Obama came, the governor came, the mayor came, you know, so you have Bloomberg, all of them there. So we're in this little library, sit in these little chairs, and he says, well, let's go to the computer lab. I'm like, there's not one. He's like, there's not a computer lab. I'm like, that's actually not what we're teaching them first. Believe it or not, they needed to learn things like how to work, how to do teamwork, how to act in a meeting with other people. They needed to learn, you know, how to write things better. I'm like, we got to go there first. If they can do that, then I can teach them the computer stuff later, right? And I can remember him being so shocked about that. And that speaks to what our schools need to teach as well, by the way. So.
And by the way, if you want to learn the soft skills, you're not going to learn it over Zoom. Just back to the work from home comment. Other.
See, I have a velvet hammer on that topic. He's more of a hammer, okay? Yeah.
I don't have time for velvet.
Yeah.
Yeah, Thomas Paulson. Thanks, President Kashkari and the club for putting this lunch on and having this opportunity. I had a question really around productivity and generative AI. And so one of the, I think, questions that economists and business people struggle with is the impact of generative AI on productivity. And there's really, you know, productivity is kind of a weird concept that's misconstrued. There's like demand-generated productivity and there's supply-side driven productivity. And a lot of people who've been talking about generative AI is more around, hey, it's going to boost our productivity from a supply side, not a demand side perspective, but it has risk of disrupting a large portion of the labor force and you know, the technology and how technology is delivered in the United States, a lot of that being people's and what IBM did, et cetera. So maybe you could kind of opine a little bit about how this all might work out such that we get constructive demand productivity, demand-generated productivity from generative AI versus, you know, the other way around. Thanks.
Did you plant that question?
I did not plant the question.
So, I'm so happy. Okay, how many people know what generative AI is? And how many of you love it? Oh, that's interesting. Like half the hands went down. Okay. Could you get, why do you love it?
It drives efficiencies.
Okay. Anybody else want to shout out why? Efficiencies? No, anybody else love it for another reason? Repetitive tasks? Okay. Yeah, that is true. I'm not good at a starting point. I could use momentum. My husband, it's a long story because he almost died a year ago. He's okay now, but I'm only telling you this because we wouldn't have done this otherwise. We reset our vows, you know, after 44 years. I mean, because otherwise we're not that sentimental. But we had to get this ceremony. So I used it because I'm like, how do you write a ceremony without like a minister, you know? So, hey, I got a good starting point, right? Did you know that? Yeah, that was how we got that. Oh, you wrote your own? No, I had to write his for me too. So, so first, I want to share with you like my biggest lesson around AI, because back to I was doing AI when AI wasn't cool, and I took a lot of arrows for this. So I'm like at the earliest of AI. I really felt a decade ago we could have gotten this going, and I spent billions on this topic as well. So a lot of constructive learning. So first I'll tell you the story I learned, and then I'm going to connect it to generative AI. Given who IBM's DNA is, it does tough stuff. It just is man on the moon. It's what we think of. Maybe not, it shouldn't have been the right starting point, but. So as we went into AI, we did oncology. We said if anything we could do is help with both making a correct diagnosis and the right treatment. As those doctors in the room, vast numbers of cancers, et cetera, in all of the different clinical trials. And so we set out. So what did I learn from that brutal set of years and experiments? Well, first I learned that actually even a decade ago, the technology was better than the human doctor. except when decisions are really consequential to you, your tolerance for an error goes to about 0 as a patient or a user. And so what I witnessed was, let's say it was wrong 20% of the time, 15. They say, this is horrible, 15, 20%. And I would be in my head, I'd be thinking, how wrong do you think your real doctor is? Or in general, not your own, but everybody else's, okay? And it's like, can be 30%. I mean, what if you're in India where there's one oncologist for 2,000 people, or, okay. But I witnessed tolerance. Then the next thing I watch with professionals, because when you talked about all the careers, they'd be like, but how did this thing know that's the answer? Prove it. Who trained it? I'd say, well, this world-leading cancer center trained it. That's just one world-leading cancer center, not my world-leading cancer center. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, then how did it come up with that answer? Okay, a professional, unless you can explain it, understand how it was trained, and then the third thing I learned from the doctors was, let me tell you what, I work 24/7 today. If I got to do more work to get this to happen, I'm not doing it. There's no time for it. Oh, that means I have to re-engineer how work is done. And they said, and by the way, they didn't, I'm saying it much more crudely to shorten it, is we live in a pay-for-service world, fee-for-service. We do not pay for outcomes. And so just because I'm shortening this up, that's not incentive enough. And so all these issues had like nothing to do with the technology. And this is now I wrap back to generative AI, which is a new form of AI. In its most simplest form, all it's doing is predicting the next word. This is how you can get such bad answers from it at times. And so it doesn't know what it's really doing. It's predicting the next word off of massive amounts of compute and connections. And so I say this, when you say what's going to happen, I personally don't believe it's going to impact all jobs. I have witnessed this because you're forgetting the human element. I mean, a plane can fly itself, and there are 2 still pilots sitting there. We said there'd be, you said this, self-driving cars would get rid of all, all the truckers
Allegedly, all the
world.
truck drivers are going to be doomed.
How's that going so
How's
far?
that going?
So that, and I don't mean to be cynical. My point is, this is going to be an issue of trust in this technology, as to the rate and pace it will move. And I also really believe that it's going to do parts of jobs. There will be some, like you said about robotic. I mean, there will be, but this is with every technology. Some big chunks will get replaced. But I'm more about, this is my worry, it's going to impact a little bit of a lot of jobs. And therefore, you and I are going to all have to learn how to use it properly. And so the issue will be trust, which is why I'm kind of perturbed by how it got introduced. Now, I can say that because I'm not the one that introduced it, because they just like let it out of the bag. That's not how I would have taken such a powerful technology. The world wasn't ready. It took Netflix, I think it took Netflix, I'm going to be generally right, something like 3 years to get to 1 million people. In Gen AI got to 100 million people in a month, right? So I mean, it was unleashed, and people didn't really know yet what to do with it and how to handle it properly. So trust will be the issue. I think the goal of it has to be to make you and I better, like the doctors, make us better, not replace us. And I think if all of you in a company doing it, if you haven't taken time to think about what the goal of it is, I don't know why somebody said the goal is to replace man. It doesn't have to be to replace man. I mean, the goal can be to make us better. And if you approach it that way, which I watched when AI was done well in companies, it was to make the humans better, and I saw a vastly different acceptance rate in it. My best story was the unions in France, in banks, who they really wanted, a financial services person, those of you guys in banking, like, do these poor people know the answer to every one of the, this is why you send me like 1,000 pages of disclosure at the end of every product I buy. I mean, these poor people. And so when you call and talk to a financial services person, they can't answer. So they viewed it as a way to not be wrong and to be able to, they want to do a good job. Most people want to do a good job. So I think our hope is it will be a great equalizer, that many people could do a harder job than they could do without it. And then I think they can make more money. So I'm actually more on the side of like, I'm hopeful if we pay attention to this trust side. And unlike social media, we pay attention to the downsides of it at the same time. Like, we knew social media had a bad underbelly, but we did nothing about that for a decade. And so we know now this Gen AI has a bad underbelly to it. It can be a bad thing. It can be harnessed by bad people. It can be taught bad stuff. I mean, forget the hallucination. I mean, it's going to take fraud. God help us through the election, what's going to happen, right? You've seen some of this already. So its future is uncertain right now, I think, given all these little dynamics. But in the long arc of things, I think that it will make us, it has a chance to actually help us remove the stuff we don't like and let humans do what humans should do, the part of the job. If you do a job that like really could be done by a machine only, okay, then your job's exposed, right? But if your job requires some thinking and reasoning and judgment, generative AI is horrible at judgment. Like, don't ask it to pick which bank strategy is the best. Horrible at judgment. So this is why, you know, I feel like as we learn more about it, I don't even remember what your question was, actually, at this point. So it's to give my Gen AI speech, right?
That was great.
Trust, steward the good and the bad of the thing, and, you know, all of us are going to have to go back to school.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Last one.
After that, no one probably wants to ask me a
No,
question.
there's a lot of hands went up.
Thank you very much, very rich. Going back to the AI thing, I mean, if all of us are nodes on this giant network called artificial intelligence, AI, generative, whatever it may be, is some good being built into this system? Will values-based decision-making, to your point, actually be one of the rules that develops this technology to help make life and death decisions, or maybe even modify interest rates favorably for some of us? Thank you.
For some of you. Look, this is a great question to end on, because I think this is in our hands, the answer to this. And so, again, for some of, there have been a lot, I did a lot of work on regulation of technologies, and I'm a strong believer that technology should be regulated, but in a certain way. Because I participated, I was talking to you about Rob Portman, the senator from Ohio, and I remember Rob called me one day, and he said, I'm trying to get the big search engines to agree on that they should be held liable if they host child pornography. He said, what do you think? Would you sign up to this? If you, and I have a hosting business and all, he said, I'm not social media, but I have a hosting business. And he says, if you were hosting child pornography, should you be held liable for it? If you knowingly had it. I said, yes. You said knowingly. So I know it's there. I'm like, yeah. I'm like, is there a trick in this? This is a pretty straightforward question to me. He said, yeah, you'd think it would be a straightforward question. I'm like, I don't even have to ask a lawyer. And, but at the time, the social media companies all said no, because they said, no, we're just a dumb pipe. Don't know what's sitting here. They do know what's sitting there. Okay, so I come back to when you say, will it be used for good? So here's like 3 simple things I think we should do to legislate it. And I do believe the Biden administration has helped. There's a lot of groups that have tried to say this. One is, don't regulate the technology, but regulate its use. So now it says, okay, if I'm going to use it to pick a movie, who really cares if that's wrong? If I'm going to use it to pick my cancer treatment, different question. My financial decisions, different questions. So the higher risk it's used for, it should be regulated. Now, to me, the easiest way to regulate it, honestly, you can't believe it from a business person, is I think there should be liability. If there's liability, you'd be surprised how fast people will self-govern themselves. It'd be really quick. Because I even said now, there's like these sayings of every earnings call, they're counting how many times they're saying generative AI. As soon as you announce liability, they'd be like, that's not generative AI, that is just data analytics, okay? And so I really believe that and so for those use cases, just like a bank today, any money laundering, I mean, all sorts of, we get held liable if we are doing these things. We got to compliance, we got to audit ourselves, we got to do this stuff. I sit on the board of JP Morgan. I mean, I understand this very well. So I think if there's second thing, so regulate its use, not the technology. Second point would be then hold people liable for misuse in high-risk cases. And then the third thing I would do is just be sure to keep the technology open, which to some of you, that may mean nothing, but to others, the big guys who own it right now would like nothing more than the government to say, register your algorithms with us for compliance. They'd be like, yes, please do that, because we're the only ones who have the manpower to do it, and that means us 3 can do it, and everybody else, every small business in the country won't get a chance. So by keeping it as open technology, then I think you have this flourishing ecosystem all around it that you don't let people own just 3 big answers to something, right? So that would be what I would do if I was king or queen for a day on this topic.
Wonderful.
That's-
Ginny, thank you so much. This was absolutely wonderful. I'm going to turn it back
Thank
over
you.
to Tim.
Tim? Thanks. Hopefully that was
Let's do it, yeah.